My guest today has a remarkable background. He's an Army Ranger and battalion commander in the Army's Old Guard, turned polyglot and scholar of ancient Near Eastern warfare, who has participated in America's post 9/11 wars in the Middle East, only now to study the somewhat arcane question of how wars used to work there in the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age. Except, and hear me out here, it's really not so arcane. For all of the advances in technology, for all the developments in culture, there were no Muslims or Christians back then, for example, for all of the pretty substantial changes the world has seen over the last 3,000 years, the patterns of conflict in the ancient Near East look a great deal like the patterns of conflict today, in terms of how and where states project influence, where they come into contact, and where they do battle. Let's get into it.
It is a prescription for war, this Iraqi invasion of Kuwait.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
We continue to face a grave situation in Iran.
The people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender.
For maps, videos, and images, follow us on Instagram, and also feel free to follow me on Twitter at Aaron B. McLean. Hi, I'm Aaron McLean. Thank you for joining School of War. I am delighted to welcome to the show today Paul Edgar, who is the Executive Director of the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas, Austin. He's got a PhD in Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures from Texas, and he is a scholar of the warfare of the ancient Near East, which is a first for us here on School of War. He's also, I have to say, Paul, I want to ask you some questions about your life and your background, because before all this, you served several decades in the U.S. Army as an infantry officer. And I started the show a couple of years ago. I would always ask guests about their backgrounds and lives. Yeah. And because I have so many authors on the show, typically the responses would be, well, I grew up, I got a PhD, and I've been writing about this subject for 30 years. And they were they were not the most colorful portions of the interviews. In your case, however, numerous deployments in wartime, indeed two wars, just service, combat service. You commanded a battalion of the Old Guard, which for those who don't know is the Army, the 3rd Infantry Regiment, which is the regiment that performs ceremonial duties and security duties in Washington, D.C. And in that capacity, you supervise the soldiers who guard the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So let me start here. Tell us about yourself, but in the course of that, explain how is it that not only an Army officer, but an infantry officer just gets up one day and decides to become a scholar, and not just a scholar, but a scholar of the late Bronze Age. Take it away.
All right, I'll do my best. So, and I'll start in college. I actually have to laugh. So some of your listeners may be familiar with a guy named Pete Blaber. And I won't go into Pete Blaber's history, but he was very much the paradigm of Ranger and Delta officers a couple of decades ago. And saw a recent podcast that he was a guest on. And I think you can say this about so many of us, not all of us, but many of us in our late teens and 20s. But I'll quote Pete Blaber. I was not a model of scholastic excellence. All right. As a high school student, and so I kind of bumbled into college, fortunately, right? I went to St. Mary's University here in Texas in San Antonio. They were, I think they were gracious to grant me entrance. For a number of reasons, I joined ROTC after my first year. And my intent was not to stay in the Army, it was to do other things. But after my first kind of simulated combat patrol, I thought, boy, this is pretty cool. Maybe I'll do this. And then I learned about the Ranger Regiment, and I said, that's really what I want to do. And fortunately, I was able to do that. I finished college, was commissioned through ROTC, went to Korea for a year, and then went to 2nd Ranger Battalion. And even at that point, I was thinking, all I wanted to do was be a Ranger platoon leader. That would be the great satisfaction of my life. And then I would separate and, I don't know, do something else. But I worked for Stanley McChrystal, was the battalion commander at the time. Tony Thomas, who commanded Delta and SOCOM, was the XO. Pete Blaber later joined the battalion. A lot of other names that you would recognize were in that unit, and it was such a phenomenal time that I decided to stay for a career. Um, and most of my time was spent as a conventional paratrooper in airborne units. That was my only rotation through the Ranger Regiment. So I went to 173rd, or what becomes the 173rd, while I was there in Italy, an airborne brigade that we stood up from scratch in Alaska as part of sort of the growth of the Army to in order to manage the demand for forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. But that's sort of the point that sort of brings me to academia. Is a couple things. One is I severed my ACL, and so I was not able to go back into the special operations world. So I had to look for something else, and that ended up being what's called the Olmsted Fellowship or Olmsted Scholarship, which is a pretty neat opportunity for kind of not quite mid-grade officers in each of the services. They sent me to Israel to learn modern Israeli Hebrew and to get a master's degree. And my master's work was essentially in Jewish literature from the Iron Age, so maybe 700, 600 BC, BCE, through the Crusades. And I studied some other things, but that was the gist of it. While I was there, we invaded Iraq, and even well before Secretary Rumsfeld allowed us to use the word counterinsurgency, most of us were talking very seriously counterinsurgency. We were reading Galula and many other things. So this is as early as 2004, but both that time at Tel Aviv University and what I found was really, and I thought all of academia was like this at the time. I've found since then that it's not, but there were a lot of academics that were producing work, and this is both historians and political scientists and linguists and others, anthropologists who happened to be downrange with us and willing to work with us. They were contributing to my understanding of what was going on and how we could best address it. And there's a bigger argument there whether or not that worked or not. I won't get into that, but I think it's more than fair to say that academics produced work and were willing to engage with us in a way that I found really profoundly helpful during those really difficult years, particularly between 2004 and when I retired in 2014. With with a number of rotations, and then kind of culminating with what I would consider, it's not the same war, but there's a similar conflict there, working on the Israeli-Palestinian issue with the United States Security Coordinator at my last year in the Army. So all of that prompted me to consider seriously a second career in academia, because I wanted to think about these things more deeply, and then be helpful to whether it's to soldiers or policymakers or the people in between, hoping that one, we could, if we go to war, that we make the best possible decisions about simply about that point, about deciding to go to war. And then two, when we are at war, to do that in a way that is, we're talking about terrible things here, but within that context, doing things as well as possible to minimize human suffering, sort of political disorder, etc. So that's kind of the background. I hope that summarizes it.
No, it's every now and then I have a guest on. It doesn't happen that often, but you and maybe Iskander Rahman. There's a couple others who I think, well, I mean, you're living my best life. How did you? This is sort of this romantic progress from the infantry to the Iron Age. I have to say, and here's a question for you. It strikes me as very commendably broad-minded on the part of the Army or the Department of Defense, whoever is actually administering Olmsted, to let you study the Iron Age, which I mean, I'm all for it. And to me, it's sort of self-evident where the value would be. And clearly you're the kind of guy who agrees. But, my impression of the administration of things like, I don't actually know anything about Olmsted, but my impression of the administration of things like this is there is a prejudice for more contemporary stuff, modern, if you're going to learn about the Middle East, you study modern Middle Eastern studies, you study, international relations theory, there's all that kind of stuff where there's probably some value depending on how you do it. And this notion that what you actually did would be at best an academic curiosity without much relevance. How is it that you were able to persuade them, or did you kind of stumble into
Well, you
it?
didn't need to. That was the nice
Okay.
thing. The Olmsted program and General George Olmsted, who put his personal, kind of fortune towards this back in the 60s. And it's a digression so that I won't go into, but it's worth learning about General George Olmsted's personal background and what led him to think that this was something that officers needed to do, not to be an area specialist, but to be better operators. The whole program is oriented not towards making regional specialists that then get put somewhere as a desk officer, but to give you deep linguistic and cultural experience in one area, so that if you have to do it again, you're deployed to war or whatever, in another area, unrelated language, etc., that you recognize the environment, even if you don't recognize the details of the culture and the language immediately. Right. That's the idea. And so really was broad-minded from the very beginning. And those who continue to run the foundation have maintained that aspect of it and have been really supportive. So I didn't even need to convince them. A lot of people do. I would say a lot of Olmsted scholars do things that are more modern, and I think there's that's natural. Nothing necessarily wrong with that, depending on what it is that they're interested in. But I just felt like if I'm in Israel with population of roughly 700 or 7 million, the Jewish state, that I should immerse myself very deeply in the things that created this people, right? And so you can go back further, certainly, but historically speaking, we can really zero in on when this group of people, the Israelites, become a much narrower people, the Jews, and that's the Iron Age.
So, Paul, I had a similar instinct to you. I was actually in college for 9/11, invasion of Iraq, invasion of Afghanistan. I briefly considered joining the service at the time, and ended up deciding not to because we won.
Right.
We invaded Iraq in March of '03, and April Saddam's statue came down and it was all over. And I thought, well, I missed that. But I had
A
already.
lot of us were worried we missed it.
Yeah, right.
Why did we have something to learn?
Exactly. Had nothing to worry about, it turns out. Oh, and then again, when I was actually in my battalion, our Iraq deployment, this is 2009, was canceled. And then
Oh my goodness.
yeah, I missed. Now I really missed it. I went to all this trouble and I really missed it. And yet again, it turns out. And then finally, when we got back from Afghanistan, I have a fond memory of sitting with my fellow lieutenants from my company on the beach, staring out at the ocean in North Carolina. And one of my good friends, who's actually been a guest on the show, O.C. Best, saying, and forgive my language, this is generally a family show, so mute me now if you have kids listening, but well, that fucking sucked. Why did you want to do that so bad? As a memory is seared into me. Anyway, to the point, I had an opportunity to go to graduate school, and I chose to do medieval Arabic thought and pitch some people on letting me do medieval Arabic thought, and they were sold on a very similar conception as yours, that, and also that I thought, that not that modern Middle Eastern studies and everything that you learn there isn't important. Of course, it's at the end of the day, it isn't. It's what you're going to do if you're going to work on these issues. You're going to work on stuff for which recent history is extremely relevant. But I also thought that stuff would inherently be easier to just pick up, and that it was the longer learning that required the more foundational learning that required an academic environment. There was nowhere I was going to read Islamic philosophy and early Islamic history other than academia.
Yeah.
And I sort of stand by, its practical impacts were limited in the sense that I was able to bluff my way out of a dispute with some pro-Taliban mullahs once by claiming that my interpretation of the Quran was superior to theirs, which was partly a bluff, but I was operating on the principle that they were bluffing too, that they had no idea. That they had memorized the Arabic, but they really didn't know what it meant. But, it was more the framing, like the confidence in my understanding of the context and the system that justifies it. Okay, so
I'm with you. I do think that, and again, not to digress on certain things, but simply to summarize that I'm actually working on this with a few colleagues, but a humanist understanding of war, politics, foreign affairs is enormously helpful. It's not just about sort of policy and data, right?
Yeah. So let's talk about your work for a bit, and then we'll come back around to your career, because I actually think that's a natural place to go, is to what does this all mean for us here in the 21st century. So, and I think it would be the best procedure here would be to start very broad and very big picture, because I will confess, even for myself, as somebody who I'm actually formally qualified, Paul, to do only two things. I'm formally trained as an infantry officer, company grade infantry officer, and I am formally trained as a handler of medieval Arabic texts with
All
with
right.
concentration in philosophy. Those are my two qualifications. So even somebody with that nerdy dimension, your scholarship precedes what I know about the Middle East by some 2,000 years at
Yeah.
least. What is the late Bronze Age? What did the Middle East look like? Like, just give us a bit of a picture of the world at that time that you focus on.
So maybe it's also worth even before that to try to summarize how we even learned about these things, because for historically, our understanding of politics and war begins more or less with Herodotus. You can go a little bit early if people are comfortable using the Hebrew Bible. You can kind of pick and choose a couple of things before that, but broadly and fundamentally, our understanding of war and politics begins with Herodotus, and that's because a lot of this material that I've been fortunate to use was still undiscovered, or had been lost and was still undiscovered until it's kind of a this is a coincidence. I haven't seen it yet, but the Joaquin Phoenix film of Napoleon, right, just came out. So
I saw it. We just did an episode with Alexander
okay, cool. We're
Brizzi
gonna
on
bring
it.
students. I hope I'm not making a mistake, but we're gonna bring a bunch of students on Wednesday night to
Huh?
an IMAX showing of it.
I,
Hopefully, there's enough.
I have a take. My take is, if you just see it as long delayed British propaganda, it works great. And it's actually quite entertaining. If you go in expecting something else, you'll be disappointed.
Okay,
But
well, I hope there's at least one or two war and statecraft lessons there that I can tease out. But so Napoleon's expedition to Egypt, right? In just so we had work with round numbers in 1800, or about 1800, his expedition to Egypt, where where the British the British take out his fleet, and so he can't return the way he had anticipated, and so he kind of marches up the more or less the coast of the Levant. Doesn't make it to Jerusalem, but sends messages. We usually consider that, and he brought a number of academics with him to kind of tease out some of these things, and I think that it prompted a real interest in the ancient Near East in ways that had not occurred before. Plus, the political conditions were right. The Ottoman Empire was weak, and so it was easier to go in and do archaeological digs than maybe it would have been 100 years before, 200 years before. But anyways, the interest and capacity to do this, to do archaeological exploration, it just sort of caught fire for more than 100 years. A lot of this was privately funded. Some of it was publicly funded, or it was kind of jointly funded, but a lot of it was private, and it was British and German and French and Italian, but everybody was getting on board. It's sort of like colonialism. Everybody thought that they should be involved with the archaeology, as well as they should have some colonies somewhere. So it was kind of a piece of that world. But we discovered we discovered so much. It began with Egyptian hieroglyphs, or what we normally refer to as Middle Egyptian, and an understanding and deciphering that language and that writing system. But then we found all these cuneiform tablets of Sumerian and Akkadian, and nobody knew what these things were. And it took decades for scholars to find it, and then we continue to find those things, right? To find those things, decipher the language, and then catalog all of the different tablets, cuneiform tablets that we found in different languages, And then once you kind of catalog all those things, then you're in a position where you can kind of sort out the history. And a lot of and kind of which documents are history, which documents are receipts, which documents are kind of arcane laws and omens. But so anyways, we're still kind of at the forefront of piecing this part of history together, because I would argue that only for a few decades or maybe 50, maybe 50, 60 years have we been in a position to begin synthesizing the historical material from not just from the late Bronze Age, but much earlier, to piece that together and develop what in academia we might call a synthetic history. And that doesn't mean it's artificial. It's just it means that you're stitching together a variety of sources to put together something that's a bigger picture. And so I'll start, kind of starting with that only recently did we know any of this stuff existed, and it took a while to sort out. And we're now in a position that we can develop the history and understand that history and in a way that we didn't. And so, of course, like I said before, we started with Herodotus, and now we can go back further. So
can I just interject?
Yeah, of course.
At the risk of taking us really off track.
Yeah.
Maybe this whole episode will just be the prelude, and then we'll record another episode. But this is fascinating to me. So how do our earliest you cite Herodotus, the foundational texts for us, the text that began our understanding of the history of the Mediterranean, the Near East, etc. So Herodotus, but also you have Thucydides' archaeology, right? There's that sort of his essay on prehistory. You've got the Bible, you got the Hebrew Bible. How do they hold up? I guess. I mean, that's a huge question.
Right.
But like, how do the accounts of prehistory in these different documents hold up in light of the kind of collated evidence that you are working on?
So one of the big, I will say that one of the big motivations early on of these archaeological expeditions was to verify the historicity of the Hebrew Bible, right? And as these things went on, people started studying Akkadian, Sumerian, Hittite, etc., in their own right and for their own sakes. But that was a big part of what drove this interest initially. So I'll say this, that what we call the Iron Age, roughly 1100 or 1000 BC or BCE through, gosh, I'm not even sure when we end the Iron Age, because to me that's so recent, right? But we usually call it, instead of saying the end of the Iron Age, I think usually we call it sort of late antiquity, the Greek and Roman era. So between about 12 or 1100 BCE and the 8th century, around 750 or so, or 800 BCE, there's just a real lack of materials in the Levant that help us put these things together. So unless, and the oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible we have are just if we go to Qumran, we're talking 200-ish, right, BCE. So there's about a 600-year gap between or longer between our copies of the Hebrew Bible and the things that they record. Right. So this is for biblical scholars, this is one of the questions, is how it's a question that remains. I would say less people are interested in it now than they were, I don't know, many decades ago, or certainly in the 1800s, but it's still of interest. And the field kind of flip-flops back and forth right now. And I think it's fair. I think this is a fair assessment, is that right now, I think there's a reasonable amount of confidence that David and Solomon were real kings. Were real kings of something like a united monarchy. That maybe the extent sometimes of the kingdom that's described in the Hebrew Bible isn't the precise boundaries, because sometimes it's pretty vast, all the way to Mesopotamia, right? So, and I'm not sure, some people would say that that's just propaganda, but I'm just not sure we always conceive of things in the same terms. So I'm not ready to jump on the propaganda bandwagon at this point. But anyways, all that to say is that as we go, we find little bits of material and textual evidence that seem to indicate, yes, David was a real king, Solomon was a real king. And then after that, certainly when you get into the 9th century and the 8th century, we start to have, and once you get to Hezekiah in the late 8th century and Sennacherib, the Assyrian, then now you can start to stitch together history very, very confidently, right? There's lots of details that are missing, but you're very confident about sort of the progression of kings, who invaded who paid tribute to who was kind of subordinated to who, what were some of the political struggles. Those things I think we can be very confident in that the Hebrew Bible captures it pretty well. When you talk about the patriarchs, that stuff it's lost, and I don't think it'll be found. I may be wrong, but I think those things will never be corroborated, just because the kind of history that it captures and the era of history and the people that it captures didn't produce the kind of material that would corroborate their existence and that sort of thing. So
right.
How's that as a digression?
No, I mean, we could talk for hours more on this, and I think that would be ultimately a disservice to the show, which is, after all, called School of War, not School of Aaron and Paul's, ongoing curiosity musings. Yeah, but so I am going to drive us towards war, but this is fascinating. So, look, I'm inclined to take us to the Bronze Age because you wrote this great article, which folks can just look up online, A Most Ancient Statecraft, the Idrimi Statue Inscription, which as an act of marketing, the title perhaps does not do justice to. It's actually fascinating as a sort of overview of, if you like, the international system of the late Bronze Age Near East and the factors at work there. So I'm inclined to ask you about that, but we have been talking about the Iron Age, which is equally interesting. So you take it where you want to go, but just back to my original question, like, tell us about this world. How did this world work?
Right. So let me signpost for the reader or the listener is that we talked about kind of the finding and decipherment of the materials that lead to our understanding of this history. We talked a little bit about the era after the one that I study the most. That's so we talked about the Iron Age, which is the era of the production of most, if not all, of the Hebrew Bible. And now we're going back further, and this would be the time, sort of this would be the time of the Exodus and the patriarchs, if we're using the Hebrew Bible as something to relate it to. And this is normally called, and we're kind of stuck with the convention. It's not always the best convention or the most helpful, but we talk about it in terms of the late Bronze Age, and that's roughly 1600 BCE through, you could go 1200 or 1100 BCE. And this is a very distinct political era, and this is one of the reasons why I studied it. When I learned that this was very much a distinct beginning, a rise, a golden age, and then a collapse of a international political system, and that this was an era, this was a really unique political era in and of itself. That's one of the things that drew me to study it. And it's convenient too, right? Because as a story, it has kind of this beginning, middle, and end, right? So, but that's roughly the time frame we're looking at. Geographically, what we're looking at is Mesopotamia, right? So Iraq, modern day Iraq. We're not yet. Persia does not yet enter the equation. That's later. That's right. That's with the Achaemenid period, or Herodotus covers some of that. But Persia is not yet a player in the ancient Near East. So we go from Mesopotamia, kind of southwest to Egypt, up the coast of the Levant into Syria, and then Anatolia, or modern day Turkey. What we would consider today Kurdistan was also involved, and I'll address that with one particular kingdom in a second. But that's that's sort of the geographic boundaries of this international system. Now they related to other parts of the world, right? We've got lots of evidence that there was certainly connection with the rest of the Mediterranean. We've got evidence that there was trade even as far as India, those sorts of things. But they were not what we might consider sort of major players in this international world. So we talked the time frame, geographic boundaries, what we would consider the states, the major states in this world. The era begins more or less with what we could call three great powers. And we don't need to talk too much about what a great power is, just for the purposes of a podcast. So consider them, they're substantial powers that have a capacity to project military and significant military and political influence across the region, the geographical region that I described. So those three states are Hatti, or the Hittites in Anatolia, Egypt, and Mitanni. And Mitanni is the kingdom that roughly would be in the area that we might consider Kurdistan today. So those are the great powers. Then you have lots of city states, or kind of what might be little more than city states in some cases in between. At the beginning of the era, these major powers, their influence tends to be isolated to their kind of geographic homeland and the areas that border. But then as they gain power and ambition and capacity, and as their own domestic situation allows, they're able to extend that power, right, and extend that influence. And Mitanni collapses. So Mitanni, after a couple hundred years, really almost evaporates, which is I won't go into the story, and so what you end up with for a big chunk of the late Bronze Age is just two great powers, Hatti and Egypt. And they expand. Hatti expands south, and Egypt expands north, and they run into each other in what today is southern Syria. They have a 3-day battle, which is mostly a stalemate. So this is the early 13th century. They battle to a stalemate, and Egypt has, if our historical records are accurate, Egypt has a little bit of an upper hand, but nothing that is politically significant. And then we can't trace this day by day or month by month or year by year, but about 10 years later, we have a treaty between the two. So sometime between that major battle and this treaty, the leaders of those two powers had to grapple with what was it that they were going to do. And let me kind of add to the story a little bit by describing in what is today really Alawite Syria, that's sort of that portion of Syria that is predominantly Alawite. That was a state or a country, a small country called, or a small state called Ugarit, from which you may be familiar with the language Ugaritic. But that was the most important port city and sort of transit point of commerce between the Mediterranean and the ancient Near East, Levant, Syria, and Mesopotamia. So it was hugely lucrative, and both Egypt and Hatti wanted to exercise substantial influence over that part of the region. And it's not too far from there that they have their three-day battle. But in any case, just to demonstrate that there was real interest here, right? There was real economic interest. Somehow, though, between that 3-day battle and the treaty, they figured, they sort of assessed their options, and they had to make choices about whether they double down militarily or whether they try to work this out in a diplomatic way, so that ideally this is kind of a win-win for both Hatti and Egypt. And I think that's what you get, really, is you get a couple hundred years of this real stable international system because the two great powers are capable of getting along with one another. And so I guess I'll go ahead and pause there. And
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's so many directions we could
yeah,
go from here. I suppose let me take us from politics sort of down to operations and
right.
tactics to the extent that you can speak to these things in any level of detail. How did they fight? How did it work?
This is a little bit difficult because many of our, we have textual evidence, right? Stories of how these armies fought, and we also have, for lack of a better term, we have artistic evidence, and then we have some archaeological evidence of battlefields. But the textual evidence and sort of the iconography or the art that depicts these battles place the king over, sort of really at the center of the story. And it's their sort of hugeness, their boldness, and their great, not just their leadership, not just their like ability to command. In fact, there's very little about command. It's about them personally trampling the opposing force, right, on their majestic horse, and it's it's usually larger than life.
That's how it
And
went for me. Is that not how it went for you, Paul?
so no, I was relying largely on the people around me, and hopefully
Oh,
once in a while
okay.
I was helpful. So 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 in terms of how the battle occurred, I'm not sure we can really say other than from other evidence, and frankly, just that we know that hand to hand combat with at most swords and spears and arrows, that it was bloody and personal and just chaos. So so there may have been more organization to it, but it's hard to decipher in the materials and the texts that we have. I will say that one of the things that we have is a really interesting Hittite text on how to train horses. So this is kind of an era where horses are being widely domesticated, and there's some argument on where that actually begins. But there's a very long Hittite text, and essentially it looks like it's like a training calendar, right? If anybody who's spent any time in the military and has set up a training calendar for a week or a month or a quarter would look at this text and say, this is exactly what it is. It's a training calendar for how you train your horses for combat. So it's pretty interesting. So there was a level of organization that we don't know about, and because the texts just don't record it in that way.
Chariots were a thing. Were they not? Should I
Yeah,
have
but
mentioned
you know,
chariots
but
here?
again, here we're in this weird position because it'll describe in terrain that was completely unsuitable for fast movement, right? It will describe the king in his chariot, and again the art that we have that depicts these battles. The giant king will be in a giant chariot and trampling all his foes, right? And then the smaller chariots and helpers are kind of behind him. So yeah, chariots were there, but I'm not sure. People have written about this,
Hmm.
and I'm just not convinced anybody's gotten it right yet. I think that it was probably helpful in repositioning a little bit, repositioning some archers, that sort of thing. But it wasn't anything like a tank battle. Right? It's
Yeah.
like which is how movies like to capture it. That's not. I don't think that was possible based on their technology and the terrain they were fighting on.
Can I ask? I realize these are sort of dumb questions for somebody who's been
There's
thinking
never
about
a
this
dumb
stuff for a long
question.
time.
So-
Well, that's a very polite thing for you to say. There is a sufficient diversity of technology
Yeah.
documented for the period. You mentioned bows and arrows, spears,
Yeah.
swords, horses. There's enough different kinds of stuff that you can move around and kill people with that you would almost expect, as you're going to go try to figure this out, that there would be some kind of combined arms
Right.
dimension to this.
Right.
That it can't just be mass A under this king encounters
Right.
mass B under that king, and then they just have a melee. I mean, I guess theoretically you could, but it seems strange that it would not have occurred to somebody there
Of
to like
course.
try to separate this
Yeah.
out a bit. So, I mean, it sounds like you
Yeah.
agree. Like, how would we even try to piece together more from
Well,
what you've
let me instead, I'll address that, but let me instead address that there are indicators that people were thinking through these things. I just don't think that we can sew it all together, right? Yeah. I mean, maybe it's maybe I just haven't discovered the materials yet, or if maybe it's in front of me and I just haven't seen it yet. But, and, and so there's an Egyptian, and this is actually this is Egyptian text before the late Bronze Age, where one of the protagonists talks about his plans, right? That his plans are so great that he's going to defeat his opponent.
Hmm.
And to me, that's one of these early indicators that there really was strategy of a sort, that there really was thoughtfulness to how I was going to go about this and outthink my enemy with the tools of war that I do have. So I do think that people were doing exactly what you described, but I don't think we have discovered the texts, or maybe we haven't properly interpreted or understood the texts that reveal these things. The texts on training a horse is another example. So we know that people were really putting some thought into these things, but how they stitched it together in terms of a combined arms effort, which I'm sure they did, we might consider it a rudimentary way, but it's absolutely still some sort of way. I'm not sure we can put that together yet.
So, I mean, I can continue to talk to you about this stuff for hours. Maybe you would come back and we can keep doing that sometime. But as promised, let me try to sort of bring it back around to the present day, and you can talk whether it's operations or strategy or politics. Take it in any direction you want. But of course, we are talking about a part of the world that is, I mean, it's at war right now in multiple ways and in multiple places. Some of these wars, you have the Syrian civil war in particular, is absolutely savage.
Right.
What happened in Israel 2 months ago, just utter savagery on October the 7th. So there is a kind of character to warfare in this part of the world in recent years that does not seem to give much evidence for the notion that things are getting more humane,
Right.
and more quote unquote modern as the years go on. There seems to be a flaw in that idea. So what continuities do you see? What parallels with all of your study of truly ancient history, more ancient than what most people mean by ancient history? What have you learned about this part of the world, and perhaps about warfare and politics more generally, that matters today?
So a few things. One is, and I mentioned before that Alawite Syria almost matches the borders of Alawite Syria and Ugari are almost identical, and so to me that's an indicator that geography influences us. That even geography at a low level influences us and our movements and the things that we're interested in, and our capacity to grow and project societies and states, etc. That those things influence us in ways that we don't even realize. So I do think that and maybe that's just one way of saying geopolitics is still a real thing. It's certainly not the only thing, and geopolitics is not sort of fate or determinative in an absolute sense, but it's hugely influential in ways that we may not even perceive. Just that the limits of a society in the late Bronze Age mirror the limits of a society in this age is at least raises some suspicion that is worth investigating. Number two is that political order, I guess, political order on an international level, and in fact, there's evidence at the domestic level as well, but from these texts, but that international order is created and sustained by willing partners, and that it's not something that we can ever take for granted. And this kind of goes to what I'm thinking of right now is the collapse of the late Bronze Age. And there are a number of things that lead to it. Like most major events in international history, there's more than one factor involved. But one of the prominent ones for the collapse of this international system was this migration or invasion of what we normally refer to as the Sea Peoples, and the Philistines, the Peleset in Egyptian texts are part of that wave of people from the Mediterranean that just starts showing up and laying waste to anything on the coast. We don't know if there was some method to it. There may have been, but it's a mystery to us at this point. It's lost to us at this point. But those societies were not ready for it, and they could have been. There's no reason why the Hittites and the Egyptians in the late Bronze Age, if they worked together, that they could not have prevented their own collapse. So I guess those are the two things that really occur, or those are a few of the things that occur to me that are true today, right? That political order is maintained by those who are collectively committed to maintaining it. That it doesn't have to be that political order, international political order, does not need to be an oppressive thing. It can be. There are certainly going to be limits and constraints and that sort of thing, but it can still be mutually beneficial, not just to the great powers, but to everybody in between. And you see that with the text. These smaller powers were frequently. There were moments when they were warring with Egypt, usually to no avail, but when they were at war with Egypt or Hatti, and there were times when Egypt and Hatti would kind of put them under their thumb. But they were also, just like we see today, people ask the United States to get involved. People ask Great Britain to get involved. They ask Australia to get involved to help them out with whatever international problem they're facing. And so that was the dynamic then too, is we have so many letters, so many diplomatic, these are cables or these are diplomatic letters, the equivalent in cuneiform and on tablets, but it's the same thing. And they're writing in a different lingua franca, but they're asking for help. They're asking for military assistance. They're asking for favor relative to their hostile neighbors. So anyways, that international order doesn't simply need to benefit the great powers, but it can be mutually beneficial to everyone involved.
Paul Edgar of the Clements Center, the University of Texas at Austin. This has been a truly fascinating conversation. I hope you'll come back sometime and continue it. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks, Eric.
This is a Nebulous Media production. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.